Picture this: New York City, draped in winter's velvet hush. The skyline burns with light against the indigo night, glass towers shimmering like promises whispered to the stars. Beneath them, the Waldorf Astoria glows with golden grandeur, its ballroom pulsing with the rhythm of power. Laughter like champagne bubbles, conversations sharp as diamonds. Every name that matters is there. CEOs, senators, old money, and new ambition, all gilded in silk, satin, and self-importance. But then, just as the orchestra swells, something shifts. The violins tremble into silence. A ripple moves through the room like wind across water. Because she has arrived. Imani Carter, the woman they once pitied, the woman they whispered about in private circles, their champagne-stained words full of curiosity and quiet cruelty. The woman they thought would never dare to show her face again. But here she is, standing at the top of the marble staircase, wrapped in midnight blue silk that catches the chandelier light like constellations scattered across her skin. Her curls are crowned in soft gold, her shoulders bare and defiant, her eyes gleaming with a calm that silences 1,000 rumors. And in that silence, every man and woman in the room feels something shift inside them. A small, unspoken recognition of grace reborn. Even he feels it. Ethan Caldwell, the man who once vowed forever to her and then broke that promise in front of the world, stands frozen near the bar. His jaw tightens. His glass trembles in his hand. For a brief, unbearable moment, the noise, the laughter, the power of the room fade, and there's only her. She walks through the crowd, slowly, deliberately, not as if she belongs here, but as if the place belongs to her. Her heels whisper against the marble floor, each step a reminder. She is not the woman he left behind. She is something infinitely more dangerous. A woman who learned how to rise without asking permission. Cameras flash, discreet but relentless. The reporters who once wrote about her downfall now scramble to capture her resurrection. Conversations restart, quieter this time, hushed with awe. "Is that really her?" someone murmurs. "She looks magnificent," another breathes. "She's changed," says a third. But they're wrong. She hasn't changed. She's simply remembered who she is. Across the ballroom, the grand chandelier reflects in her eyes, fragments of light dancing over dark irises that hold centuries of stories. The descendants of those who were told to stand at the edge of rooms now walk straight through their center. And tonight, every glimmer in her gaze carries that legacy. A senator steps forward to greet her, then a magazine editor, then an actress she once admired. They each speak her name with newfound reverence. Not because she's famous, but because she's fearless. And Ethan? He can't look away. His throat tightens with a strange ache, something between regret and disbelief. The woman he tried to silence has returned, not as a ghost, but as a storm in heels. When she finally glances in his direction, it isn't with anger. It's something far more devastating: indifference. Because the opposite of love isn't hate. It's not caring at all. The orchestra resumes, softer now, as if even the music bends itself around her presence. And as she steps onto the dance floor, laughter follows her like perfume, effortless and alive. Every movement of her body seems to rewrite the narrative he once imposed upon her: the obedient wife, the silent partner, the woman grateful to be chosen. Not anymore. Now she is the chooser. And though the gala sparkles with gold and applause, the air hums with a quiet tension that no one dares name. The sense that history is being rewritten in real time. The socialites feel it. The journalists sense it. Even the chandeliers seem to tremble under the weight of what's unfolding. Because this isn't just her return, it's her declaration. Imani Carter has come home. Not to him, not to their world, but to herself. And every person watching, from the billionaire with his crystal flute to the young woman holding her breath at the edge of the room, knows they're witnessing something far greater than beauty or scandal. They're watching power rediscovered. She pauses at the center of the ballroom, turns toward the grand mirror above the orchestra pit, and for a fleeting instant, she smiles. Not at her reflection, but at the memory of the girl who once doubted she belonged. Then, she looks up. And with that quiet, radiant certainty that only a woman reborn can carry, she whispers to herself, barely audible beneath the music, Let them see. And oh, they do. They see her rise. They see her reclaim. They see what grace looks like when it's no longer seeking approval. Because power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks into a room and makes the world go silent. If you've ever watched someone rise from the ashes with that same quiet fire, or if you've ever felt your own light dimmed by someone who couldn't handle its brilliance, this story is for you. Tap that heart, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel to see what happens when Imani's silence turns into strategy. Because tonight's just the beginning. 6 months earlier, Manhattan woke beneath a pale winter sun, its light spilling over the river like liquid silver. In a penthouse high above Park Avenue, Imani Carter stood by the window, her reflection framed by glass and skyline. Below, the city hummed with its endless rhythm, horns, ambition, and dreams built on caffeine and sleepless desire. She had once found comfort in that sound. It was the pulse of progress, the promise that anything was possible if you worked hard enough. But that morning, even the city seemed to keep its distance from her. The apartment was immaculate, the kind of perfection that came from money, not warmth. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by Ethan. All marble and muted tones, designed to look timeless but somehow soulless. She used to joke that it felt like living inside a luxury catalog. Now she realized it had been a cage disguised as elegance. On the kitchen island sat a bouquet of pale, white roses. Ethan's assistant sent them every Friday like clockwork. The card always read the same: "For my brilliant wife." But brilliance had never been what he wanted. What he wanted was a reflection, something polished, soft-spoken, and easily placed beside him in photographs. And for a time, Imani had tried to be that reflection. Before the marriage, she had been fire, a creative director at one of the top branding agencies in New York, known for her sharp vision and unapologetic confidence. Clients fought to work with her. Her ideas transformed forgotten companies into icons. She had earned her place in every room she entered, through talent, not lineage. Then came Ethan Caldwell, the charming heir to a banking dynasty, his smile carved from privilege and promise. He courted her with an intensity that felt almost cinematic. Candlelit dinners at the Met, handwritten notes left in her office, weekend getaways to Lake Placid just to breathe above the noise. He said he loved her ambition, her intelligence, her drive. "You're different, Imani," he used to whisper against her skin. "You make me better." She believed him. Their wedding was a society event, featured in glossy spreads and whispered about in the circles of old Manhattan. The union of two worlds, his inherited empire and her earned brilliance. The headlines called it a modern American love story. She wore a silk gown that moved like water, and when he looked at her under the vaulted ceiling of St. Patrick's Cathedral, she thought, this is what forever looks like. But forever began to change its shape. It started subtly, as these things always do. A comment here, a correction there. Maybe tone down the jewelry, he'd suggest before a client dinner. You don't want to seem too bold. Or, maybe let me handle this pitch. They'll take it better from me. At first, she dismissed it as protection, the gentle guidance of a man navigating the fragile egos of powerful rooms. But protection soon became possession. Her ideas became their ideas. Her words were edited, softened, sometimes erased. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to disappear inside the perfection he demanded. Even his mother, Margaret Caldwell, played her part, smiling too politely, her eyes always scanning for fault. "You're lovely, dear," she'd say during brunches at the family estate in Connecticut. "So vibrant." I imagine it must be exhausting to keep up that energy. Vibrant. That word haunted Imani. It was how white society complimented black women when they didn't want to call them too much. Ethan never defended her. He would just laugh lightly and change the subject. "Mother means well," he'd murmur later. "You know how she is. Don't take it personally." But she did. Because it wasn't just his mother. It was his colleagues who assumed she was his assistant, his friends who called her impressive for her background, the waiters who looked to him for the check, the photographers who asked her to stand a little to the side. Each slight was small, almost invisible on its own, but together they built a fortress of quiet humiliation. And she, once so fierce, began to shrink. There were moments, though, when she glimpsed the woman she had been, when her laughter slipped free, or when she caught her reflection and saw something defiant still burning behind her eyes. But each time Ethan noticed, "You've been tense lately," he'd say gently, brushing a hand down her arm. "Maybe you should rest more. You don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to prove anything." It sounded like love, but it was a leash. The breaking point came on a sun-drenched afternoon in June, at the Caldwell's annual charity gala in the Hamptons. The gardens were alive with music and money, champagne fountains, silk gowns, laughter that never quite reached the eyes. It was the kind of event that made the society pages, a glittering parade of influence. Imani had just returned from closing one of the biggest campaigns of her career, a deal that could redefine luxury branding through inclusivity and innovation. She was radiant that day, her joy unfiltered, her pride honest. And for a moment, surrounded by those who had once doubted her, she felt seen again, until she heard his voice. Ethan was standing by the bar with a group of his old college friends, all expensive suits and careless grins. "She means well," he was saying, his tone light, almost joking. "But you know how it is. Black women, they've got this passion. Everything's a fight, everything's dramatic. Laughter. Easy, familiar, privileged laughter." Then another voice. "Guess she forgot she married into a quieter world." More laughter. And Ethan, smiling, added softly, "Sometimes I wonder if I should have married someone who fits the part better." The glass in Imani's hand slipped. It didn't shatter. It just fell against the marble table and rolled, spilling white wine across her gown. But inside her, something broke so loudly she thought the world must have heard it. People noticed. Eyes turned. But no one said a word. No one ever did. She walked out of that garden without a sound, past the champagne, the laughter, the ocean breeze that carried her last illusion away. She didn't cry until she reached her car. And even then, the tears came not from heartbreak, but from the sudden, unbearable clarity of truth. She wasn't his equal. She was his lesson, and she was done being taught. That night, she packed one suitcase. She left her wedding ring on the marble countertop, right beside the roses that had already begun to wilt, and stepped into the city alone. For the first time in years, there was no driver waiting, no assistant arranging her path, just her and the sound of the city breathing around her. Manhattan didn't notice her leaving, but someday soon it would remember her return. The summer air shimmered that afternoon, soft and golden, the kind of light that made even the Hamptons look like a painting. The Caldwell estate stretched across rolling lawns and rose gardens, its white terraces lined with glass lanterns that swayed gently in the ocean breeze. Strings of pearls adorned the tables, the champagne flowed like music, and the laughter of New York's elite mingled with the whisper of waves beyond the dunes. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, the Caldwell's annual charity gala, an event covered in every glossy magazine, a tradition of wealth wrapped in benevolence. And for Imani Carter, it was a moment she had secretly longed for, a chance to feel that she truly belonged. She had spent the morning preparing carefully, every movement deliberate, every choice intentional. Her gown, a deep emerald silk that hugged her silhouette and shimmered when the sun touched it, was her quiet rebellion. Her curls, usually tamed for Ethan's preference, framed her face in soft, defiant waves. When she descended the grand staircase of their home that morning, Ethan had glanced up briefly from his phone, smiled politely and said, "Beautiful." Maybe a touch bold for the family crowd, but beautiful. It was a warning wrapped in flattery, and she knew it. But she wore the dress anyway. By late afternoon, the garden was alive with conversation and applause. The scent of peonies and ocean salt mingled with perfume and money. Imani moved through the crowd gracefully, the way one learns to when every glance feels like an assessment. She smiled where she needed to, charmed when expected, and stood a little straighter than she felt. Still, beneath the polish, a spark of genuine pride glowed in her chest. Her latest marketing campaign, a bold collaboration between a luxury brand and a collective of Black female artists, had just been announced to rave reviews. It was the kind of work that didn't just sell products. It told stories. It meant something. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. The woman who created beauty from ideas, not from someone else's approval. She was speaking animatedly to a group of Ethan's business associates by the infinity pool, describing how the campaign had exceeded every projection. Her eyes shone as she spoke about representation, creativity, impact, words she once used daily but had almost forgotten the taste of. And that was when she heard it, a familiar laugh, Ethan's laugh. It carried easily across the terrace, confident, magnetic, too loud. He stood a few yards away, surrounded by his college friends, the kind of men who had inherited influence rather than earned it. They leaned in close to him, sipping their whiskey, their smiles sharp and knowing. At first, she didn't pay attention. She had grown used to his voice cutting through every room, to his need to fill silence with charm. But then she caught her own name. Imani's passionate, he was saying, his tone light, teasing. You know how it is. She gets worked up about her projects. Very expressive. It's cultural, I think. The men chuckled. She's got that fire, one of them added. It's exotic. The word sliced through her. Exotic. Like she was something to be collected, admired, and ultimately contained. Ethan smirked. Exactly. Sometimes I forget she didn't grow up in this world. She means well, but she can be intense. My mother says it's refreshing. Occasionally exhausting, but refreshing. The laughter this time was unrestrained. Imani's voice faltered mid-sentence as her companion's attention shifted subtly toward the sound. She forced a smile, pretending not to hear, but the laughter clung to her like smoke. Her pulse quickened, her throat tightened. Every instinct told her to walk away, but her feet refused to move. And then he said it, the sentence that would hollow out everything between them. Sometimes I think I should have married someone simpler, someone who fits the part better. A pause. Jessica always understood our world. There it was, the name, Jessica Moreland, his old flame, the blonde daughter of an old banking family, the one whose presence lingered in every room Imani ever entered. The men roared with laughter. Ethan raised his glass and drank, looking utterly at ease. For a heartbeat, the world around her fell away. The garden, the music, the chatter. All of it blurred into a low, echoing hum. Her hand trembled around her champagne flute, the bubbles blurring into the tears that gathered but refused to fall. Every sound became distant, hollow. She could hear the crash of the waves beyond the garden, the faint clink of ice against crystal. She could even hear her own heartbeat, steady but fragile, as though it might shatter with one more careless word. And then she saw them, the eyes, watching, not with compassion, but curiosity. Guests whispering behind manicured hands, glancing between her and Ethan, as if witnessing a small tragedy performed for their amusement. Her throat tightened. For a moment she wanted to scream, to confront him, to demand the apology he would never give. But what would be the point? In this world, anger would make her everything they said she was. Too loud, too emotional, too much. So she did what they never expected. She smiled, a soft, dignified, devastating smile, the kind that says, "You can't touch me anymore." Then she placed her untouched glass on the table, turned away from the crowd and walked across the garden, through the marble arches, down the stone steps that led toward the sea. Each step was a goodbye. The sunlight shimmered on the horizon as she reached the edge of the lawn, the hem of her dress catching in the wind. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with salt and freedom. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt empty, but that emptiness was a kind of clarity. Behind her, laughter rose again, echoing through the estate like a ghost she was already learning to ignore. By the time Ethan realized she was gone, the sun had set. She drove back to Manhattan with the windows down, the ocean wind tangling her hair, her hands steady on the wheel. Somewhere along the highway, she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, mascara smudged, eyes bright, mouth set in silence. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window of their penthouse, watching the city's lights flicker like distant promises. Around her, everything was pristine. The curated art, the polished floors, the scent of white roses that had begun to fade. At midnight, she rose, crossed the room, and slid the diamond ring from her finger. It felt heavier than it ever had before. She placed it on the marble counter beside the bouquet, its petals now curling at the edges. Then she whispered the only goodbye he would ever get. Thank you for teaching me what love isn't. And with that, Imani Carter, the wife, the ornament, the illusion, ceased to exist. What remained was something the world wasn't ready for yet, a woman who had lost everything, and in doing so, had nothing left to fear. The city was quiet that night, a rare stillness that wrapped Manhattan in velvet shadow. A thin mist hung over the river, softening the skyline, as if even the lights of New York had dimmed in sympathy for her. Somewhere far below, a taxi horn echoed like a heartbeat fading in the distance. Imani stood at the window of their penthouse, barefoot, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. The air smelled faintly of rain and roses, the same white roses that Ethan's assistant had delivered that morning, now wilting on the kitchen counter. Their petals had begun to curl, translucent around the edges, like a beauty too carefully preserved. On the marble table behind her, her wedding ring gleamed in the half-light. She had taken it off hours ago, just after returning from the Hamptons, and it sat there still, a small, perfect circle of gold that now felt like a shackle she'd finally undone. The party had ended hours earlier, but its echoes remained. The sound of laughter, the cruel ease of his words, the way everyone had looked at her, pity painted over fascination. Those memories clung to her like smoke. Ethan had texted once, "Where are you?" Then again, "We need to talk." She hadn't replied. She wouldn't. Instead, she had driven home alone through the dark, the highway lights streaking past her windshield like falling stars. Every mile between her and that mansion felt like another layer of illusion peeling away. By the time she reached the city, her hands were steady again. She parked the car in the garage and rode the elevator up to the penthouse in silence, her own reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls. Now, standing by the window, she watched the clouds move slowly over the skyline. The city never really slept. It only pretended to. Just like she had. The sound of the elevator startled her, the soft chime, the distant click of polished shoes. She turned as Ethan entered, his expression composed but his eyes sharp, his voice low and coaxing. "Imani," he said almost tenderly, "you left without saying goodbye." She said nothing. He loosened his tie, setting his keys down on the counter. "You're overreacting. It was just a joke. You know how those events are. Everyone exaggerates after a few drinks." Her gaze was steady, unreadable. "You humiliated me." His mouth tightened. "No one took it seriously. They were laughing with me, not at you." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Do you really believe that?" He looked at her for a moment, confusion flickering across his face. Then, as always, he tried to regain control, his tone softening. "You're tired. It's been a long week. You've been so emotional lately, I think." "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't use that word." "What word?" "Emotional. It's how you erase me. Every time I speak, every time I hurt, you call it emotion, as if it's weakness." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not your enemy, Imani. We've built something beautiful together. You can't just walk away from it." Her eyes flicked toward the ring glinting on the marble counter. "I already have." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the whisper of the rain beginning against the windows. He stared at her, at the calmness in her face, at the quiet certainty that unnerved him more than anger ever could. "This isn't you," he said finally. "You don't throw things away. You're better than that." "No," she said softly. "I'm just finally being me." He took a step closer, his voice dropping into the same tone he used in boardrooms. Persuasive, practiced, commanding. "You're making a mistake. You think you'll find something better out there? You won't. You belong here, with me." The words struck her like ice. You belong here. That was the truth of it. Not love, not partnership, but ownership. Imani looked at him, really looked at him, and saw, for the first time, not the man she had fallen for, but the man he had always been. Beautiful, brilliant, and utterly blind to anything beyond himself. "No," she whispered, her voice as calm as rain. "I belonged to myself before I ever met you." Ethan's face hardened. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she was already moving, past him, toward the hallway. Her suitcase waited by the door, packed with quiet precision. She had filled it earlier that evening. A few clothes, her passport, her laptop, the small photograph of her mother she kept beside her desk. Everything else she was willing to leave behind. "Where will you go?" he demanded. She turned the handle of the door, the faintest smile on her lips. "Anywhere that doesn't remind me of you." He took a step forward. "You'll regret this, Imani. The world isn't kind to women who walk away." She paused, her back still to him. "Then it's time the world learned." The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. Not the slam of anger, but the sound of peace reclaiming itself. Outside, the night opened around her like freedom. The city air was cool against her skin, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without permission. She didn't look back. She walked down the quiet street toward the place where the taxis waited, her suitcase trailing softly behind her. Neon signs shimmered on wet pavement, and the rain turned the city lights into rivers of color: gold, crimson, blue. Each reflection seemed to whisper a promise. You're not lost, you're becoming. When the cab stopped for her, she slid into the back seat and gave the driver a single address: a small boutique hotel on the edge of Brooklyn Heights, one she had passed 100 times but never entered. As the car pulled away, she pressed her forehead to the window. The city blurred around her, a collage of light and shadow. Somewhere behind her, on the 42nd floor of a glass tower, Ethan Caldwell was pacing an empty apartment filled with roses and regret. But she wasn't thinking of him anymore. She was thinking of the ocean, of Maine, of the places she had always promised herself she'd visit but never had. She was thinking of her mother's voice, gentle but certain. You were born to build, not to beg. And for the first time since her world began to crumble, she smiled. Not out of triumph, but out of recognition. The woman reflected in the rain-streaked window wasn't broken. She was unfinished. The taxi disappeared into the night, carrying her toward an unfamiliar horizon, away from marble floors and empty apologies, toward something raw, uncertain, and real. By dawn, when the first blush of morning touched the East River, she was gone. And in that absence, in the quiet spaces where her laughter once lived, something began to bloom. Not anger, not revenge. Freedom. The ocean met the morning in a quiet conversation of light and wind. Pale sunlight spilled across the water, turning each wave into a fragment of glass. On the rocky coast of a small town in Maine, Imani Carter stood barefoot on the damp sand, the hem of her linen dress brushing her ankles. The salt air tangled her curls, the chill kissed her skin, and for the first time in years, she felt the unfamiliar rhythm of stillness. Here, no one knew her name. No one cared who her husband was. No one looked twice when she walked into a cafe with her notebook and a silence she no longer had to explain. She had arrived 3 days earlier. One suitcase, one heart cracked clean through. The boutique inn overlooked the harbor, a white clapboard building wrapped in the scent of pine and sea. Its owner, an older woman named May, had handed her the key without questions. You look like someone who needs the ocean, she'd said simply. And perhaps she did. Because each morning, Imani woke to its voice, that eternal rhythm that refused to rush, refused to break. The sea did not apologize for its strength. It simply existed, wild and certain. She began to walk along the shoreline every dawn, her bare feet sinking into the cold, grainy earth. With each step, she tried to leave something behind. The words that had wounded her, the laughter that had haunted her, the pieces of herself she had given away too freely. For the first time since the night she left, she began to breathe without counting the cost. There were moments of ache, of course. Grief never leaves quietly. Sometimes she would wake in the dark, her chest tight with memory. The way he used to brush her hair from her eyes, the way his voice could make a room hush with charm. She would remember the woman she had been, hopeful, trusting, proud, and wonder if that woman could ever exist again. But then morning would come, and with it, the ocean. Each sunrise, she walked a little farther, spoke a little louder to herself. She began writing again, not emails or presentations, but words she hadn't used in years. Thoughts, dreams, fragments of what it felt like to be alive without permission. Her journal became a small rebellion, filled with sentences that didn't ask to be understood. By the end of the first week, she had stopped checking her phone. By the end of the second, She no longer flinched at the sound of his name when the news played faintly in the inn's lobby. One evening, as the sky faded into rose and violet, she found herself sitting on the dock beside a fisherman mending his nets. He nodded at her, eyes kind but curious. "You're not from around here," he said. "No," she admitted, "just passing through." He smiled faintly, his hands still moving. "Then take your time passing. The world will still be there when you're ready to face it." It was such a simple truth, but it landed like grace. That night, she returned to her room and stood before the mirror. The woman staring back at her was not polished, not perfect. Her curls were wild, her eyes tired but luminous. She traced her reflection with her fingertips as though greeting an old friend. "I missed you," she whispered. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't dared to believe. She hadn't lost herself. She had only been buried beneath years of compromise. And now, she was unearthing. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet began to change her. She learned the taste of solitude, not as loneliness, but as luxury. She rediscovered the small rituals she had abandoned: reading before bed, painting her nails a color she actually liked, cooking dinner just for herself. She even danced once, barefoot on the wooden floor, to a song that drifted from a distant radio. It wasn't graceful, but it was hers. One morning, while sipping coffee at the inn's small terrace, she unfolded a local newspaper left on the next table. There, on the front page, was a headline about the Caldwell Foundation. Ethan's family had donated an extravagant sum to a new art museum in an attempt to recover their image. She stared at the article for a long time, at his photograph, at the practiced smile she once thought sincere. Then she folded the paper neatly and set it aside. The past, she realized, had no power unless she kept opening its pages. Instead, she opened her laptop. Not to look back, but forward. The cursor blinked on an empty document, a tiny heartbeat on a blank horizon. Slowly, she began to type. Nova. The name came to her like a whisper, Latin for new star, a beginning born from collapse. The words flowed, ideas, vision, fragments of everything she once believed in. Creativity, authenticity, representation. She wrote not as a marketer, not as a wife, but as a woman who had seen what silence cost and refused to pay it again. By midnight, she had written a plan, rough, imperfect, daring, a vision for something she didn't yet know how to build but needed to. When she finally closed the laptop, she felt a lightness she hadn't known since before her marriage. Not joy exactly, but purpose, the kind that hums quietly, like the sea outside her window. In the days that followed, she started reaching out to old colleagues, people who had known her before the Caldwells, people who had admired her brilliance rather than envied her proximity to wealth. She didn't mention Ethan. She didn't need to. Those who remembered her voice recognized it immediately, even through the phone, steady, decisive, alive. And as she spoke, she began to understand that leaving hadn't been an ending. It had been a clearing. Every life, she thought, needs a winter, a season where things fall away so something truer can bloom. By the third week, her eyes no longer carried the dullness of survival. She started wearing color again, crimson scarves, gold earrings, shades that sang against her skin. She met May for breakfast and laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that startled them both. "I think," May said with a knowing smile, "you're almost ready." "Ready for what?" May looked out toward the horizon, where the sun broke over the sea in ribbons of gold. "For the rest of your story." Imani followed her gaze, the morning light catching in her eyes. And for the first time, she didn't fear what was next. Because the woman who had fled that night in Manhattan was gone, and the one standing here was just beginning to remember what it meant to live freely, fiercely, and without apology. The tide rolled in, curling softly around her feet. She closed her eyes, inhaled the salt air, and whispered to the wind, "I'm coming back." Not to him, not to the past, but to herself, the self she had almost forgotten, the self she would never lose again. The ocean roared its answer, timeless and sure. And in that moment, Imani Carter was reborn. The morning she decided to return to New York, the sky over the Maine coast was the color of pale gold. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine, And for once, it didn't sting her face. It stirred her awake. Imani Carter stood by the window of her small room at the inn, watching the ocean sway in its eternal rhythm. She had come here a ghost. Now she was something else entirely, solid, grounded, alive. Her laptop sat open on the desk, its screen glowing softly. Across it stretched a single word, Nova, a name, a symbol, a promise, the beginning of her empire. That morning, she booked her flight back to Manhattan, not to reclaim the life she'd lost, but to build one he could never touch. The city greeted her, not with warmth, but with recognition. Its pulse matched her own, restless, resilient, unwilling to sleep. She moved back into a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights, sunlight spilling through tall windows that overlooked the harbor. It wasn't luxury, but it was hers. Every item inside it, every plant, every book, every mug, was chosen by her hands, for her peace. In the stillness of her first night back, she wrote out her plan in neat, deliberate lines. Step 1, reclaim her name. Step 2, build her brand. Step 3, redefine her power. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. So the next morning, she reached out to the one person she trusted with both her secrets and her ambitions. Ruth Delgado. Ruth was everything Ethan's world wasn't. Sharp, fearless, and utterly unimpressed by power that came from inheritance. A civil rights attorney with a reputation for exposing injustice at the highest levels, she answered Imani's call with her usual blunt grace. "I was wondering when you'd be ready," Ruth said when they met at a cafe in Midtown. She was dressed in black, her silver jewelry glinting against her dark skin, eyes alive with intelligence. "You've been quiet too long, my friend. What's your move?" Imani took a sip of coffee, her hands steady. "I'm not coming back to fight him. I'm coming back to build something bigger." Ruth leaned forward. "Bigger than Ethan Caldwell? Bigger than his world," Imani said softly. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then smiled. The kind of smile that came when a lawyer smelled blood and justice at the same time. "Then you'll need two things, strategy and protection. And lucky for you, I specialize in both." Over the next few weeks, the two women began weaving their plan. Ruth examined the contracts and financial records from Imani's marriage. What she found was both infuriating and empowering. Years of manipulation disguised as partnership. There were business ventures where Ethan had used her name but erased her credit. Deals she had brokered. Profits funneled into his family's accounts. Classic control tactics, Ruth said, flipping through the documents. "They underestimate you." "That's their first mistake," Imani nodded. "And their last." At the same time, she began the quiet work of resurrection. She reached out to old colleagues from her days at the agency, people who remembered her brilliance before it was dimmed. One of them, Camille Harrington, a CEO in the tech industry, met her for lunch at the Soho House terrace. "You're starting something new," Camille said, stirring her drink, eyes assessing but kind. "Tell me what it looks like." Imani exhaled slowly, choosing her words with care. "It's called Nova Strategies, a creative firm that doesn't just sell luxury, it redefines it. We'll work with brands that understand diversity not as a trend, but as a truth, the kind of companies that believe storytelling can shift culture." Camille smiled. "You're not pitching me. You're prophesying." "Maybe both," Imani said with a quiet laugh. Camille set her glass down. "You'll have my support. I've been waiting for something like this." That night, Imani walked home under the glow of city lights. The same streets that once felt suffocating now pulsed with opportunity. Every sound, the distant siren, the hum of traffic, the rhythm of heels on pavement, felt like the heartbeat of her rebirth. Within a month, she had assembled her team, designers, writers, digital strategists, each one handpicked not for pedigree, but for purpose. They worked out of a small loft in Tribeca, where mismatched furniture met immaculate vision. The air smelled of espresso and ambition. Imani's desk sat near the window, overlooking the skyline. On the wall behind her hung a framed photograph of her mother, smiling, strong, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a protest sign in the other. It reminded her of where she came from, of the grit and grace that had built her from the inside out. She led her team, not with fear, but with fire. Every meeting was alive with energy, every idea built on truth. Nova Strategies wasn't just a company, it was a declaration, a refusal to exist quietly. And people noticed. Word spread quickly through Manhattan's creative circles. The woman who had vanished was back. Clients began calling. Journalists started asking questions. She declined interviews, letting her work speak first. When the first major contract came through, a collaboration with a Parisian luxury house looking to redefine its image, Imani stood alone in her office long after her team had left. She looked out over the glowing city, her reflection caught in the glass. This time, the light in her eyes didn't belong to anyone else. Meanwhile, Ruth's investigation into Ethan's financial dealings began to bear fruit. Documents surfaced showing that several of Imani's projects had directly funded Caldwell Ventures. Her name had been used without consent. Her success had been monetized and buried beneath his. When Ruth handed her the file, Imani read every page in silence. Then she looked up, her expression serene but resolute. "This isn't just about what he took from me," she said. "It's about what women like me are told we don't deserve to keep." Ruth nodded. "Then let's make sure you get it all back." With interest. Each night, when the workday ended, Imani would return to her apartment overlooking the water. She would light a single candle by the window, open her journal, and write. Not about him, but about the woman she was becoming. One evening, she wrote a single line that summed up everything she had lived and lost. "They mistook my silence for surrender. They'll learn it was strategy." And as the city lights flickered across her reflection, Imani Carter realized that she no longer needed to prove herself to the world. The world would come to her. Her fall had been public. Her return would be legendary. The first thing Imani learned about rebuilding was that it rarely begins with triumph. It begins with patience and quiet. Her new office wasn't much to look at. A sunlit loft tucked above a coffee roastery in Tribeca, where the scent of roasted beans drifted through the floorboards, and the hum of the espresso machine below blended with the soft rhythm of creativity beginning again. The space had exposed brick walls, uneven floors, and a single window that framed a slice of New York's sky. But when she stepped inside that first morning, carrying nothing but her laptop and a vase of yellow tulips, it felt sacred. It wasn't the kind of room Ethan Caldwell would have approved of. Too imperfect, too alive. And that was exactly why she loved it. She placed the flowers on the windowsill and whispered, "Let's begin." In the early days, Nova Strategies was less an agency and more a dream stitched together by sheer will. Imani worked 16-hour days, building everything from scratch. The branding, the vision, the foundation. She designed the logo herself, a soft burst of light emerging from darkness, the symbolic birth of something new. She learned how to be her own accountant, her own assistant, her own strategist. Every client call, every invoice, every presentation carried her fingerprints. She was exhausted, yes, but also alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Gone were the sterile boardrooms and polite applause of the corporate world. Here, ideas were born on coffee-stained napkins, scribbled at midnight, refined at dawn. There was laughter between setbacks and silence between breakthroughs. It was raw, chaotic, and utterly hers. Her first hire was a young designer named Maya Torres, whose portfolio pulsed with color and courage. Imani met her at a small gallery opening in Harlem, where Maya's work, murals of women painted in bold strokes and defiant shades, stopped her in her tracks. "You don't paint faces," Imani said to her. "You paint voices," Maya grinned. "Then maybe I should be working for someone who listens." Within a week, she was in the Tribeca loft, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching concepts for their first client. She brought music, energy, and a kind of fearlessness that reminded Imani of her younger self. Next came Devin Lee, a quiet, meticulous analyst with a background in market psychology. He had once worked for a multinational firm but left after realizing that authentic storytelling had become a corporate slogan instead of a principle. When he met Imani, he told her simply, "I'm tired of helping people sell illusions. I want to help them tell truth." With every new addition, the team grew, not just in size, but in soul. They shared takeout dinners over mood boards. They worked through weekends, powered by coffee and conviction. Some nights, when exhaustion pressed too hard, They would open the windows and let the city's hum remind them why they were here. Because they believed in something beautiful, something bigger than themselves. The first major campaign came from an unexpected place, a Parisian luxury brand known for exclusivity and restraint. Its creative director, Julien Moreau, reached out to Imani after reading one of her thought pieces about diversity in design. "I think we've lost touch," he said during their first meeting over video call. His French accent softened his candor. "Luxury has become quiet, too white, too safe. I want to change that. I want you to help me." Imani smiled. "Then you have to be ready for the noise that comes with honesty." He was. For weeks, Nova Strategies worked on the rebranding. The campaign, titled Human Fabric, told stories of artisans from Senegal, Peru, and India, crafting pieces by hand, weaving culture into couture. It was bold, it was real, and it was everything Ethan's world would have dismissed as too emotional. When the campaign launched, it set the industry ablaze. Articles called it a masterpiece of inclusive storytelling. Sales soared, but more importantly, conversations began about ownership, about representation, about authenticity. Imani's name began to surface again, not as a wife or a scandal, but as a visionary. Yet she stayed quiet, letting her work do the talking. Still, success did not erase the shadows of exhaustion. Some nights, when the office was dark and the city buzzed below, she felt the weight of everything she was building pressing on her chest. There were bills to pay, deadlines to meet, and moments when her hands shook from too much coffee and too little rest. But she no longer feared struggle. She had made peace with the growing pains of her own becoming. One evening, Maya found her still working at midnight, the glow of the screen illuminating the tired elegance of her face. "You ever sleep, boss?" Maya asked, leaning against the doorframe. Imani smiled faintly. "I'll sleep when the foundation holds." Maya crossed her arms. "It already does. You built it." Imani looked around the room, the scattered sketches, the pinned concepts, the laughter still echoing faintly from earlier in the night. And she realized that maybe Maya was right. This wasn't a fragile beginning anymore. It was a structure, rough but enduring, shaped by intention and faith. She thought of her mother again, of her voice in the kitchen all those years ago. "You can build anything, Imani, as long as you remember why." Her why was no longer survival. It was legacy. By the end of that first year, Nova Strategies had moved from a whisper to a roar. 3 new clients signed on, all drawn to the same thing, her clarity. She spoke not like an executive, but like an artist who had learned to turn her wounds into wisdom. During a press interview, a journalist asked her, "What drives your success?" Imani thought for a long moment before answering. "Truth. We build from it. We rise because of it." The quote became the headline, printed in bold across the business section of the New York Times. Ethan must have seen it. She was sure he did. But she didn't think about that anymore. Because this was not revenge. This was resurrection. On the anniversary of the day she walked away from him, she returned to the coast of Maine. The same wind greeted her, softer now, as if it remembered her name. She stood at the edge of the sea, her heels sinking into the cool sand, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to him, not to the pain, but to the part of herself that had refused to die when everything else fell apart. The waves crashed gently in reply, and Imani smiled. She had built something from nothing, again. But this time, it wasn't made of glass and gold. It was made of truth. And truth, she knew now, never breaks. The city that once felt like a battlefield had become her blueprint. Every morning, as the first light brushed across the skyline, Imani Carter watched from the wide window of her office, the hum of traffic below harmonizing with the quiet pulse of her purpose. Nova Strategies had survived its infancy and was now stretching, growing, demanding more of her. But unlike the world she had left behind, this growth didn't drain her. It expanded her. She was no longer clawing for air at the top of someone else's mountain. She was building her own. And she wasn't building it alone anymore. By spring, Nova's small Tribeca loft had become too full, of people, ideas, and energy. So Imani signed a lease for a new headquarters in Chelsea, a light-filled space with high ceilings and walls of glass. The team painted the walls themselves, Maya leaving her signature, a small golden brushstroke, in the corner of every room. For good luck. It wasn't sleek in the traditional sense. There were mismatched chairs, plants in teacups, art leaning against walls waiting to be hung. But the energy there was undeniable. It felt like possibility. Imani stood at the center of it one morning as sunlight spilled across the floor. Around her, her growing team buzzed with laughter and focus. She realized that the dream she had whispered into the ocean months ago had taken on a heartbeat. It was living, breathing, creating. And at the edges of that hum stood the people who had become her allies, the architects of her new world. Maya Torres, the young designer she'd found in Harlem, had evolved into Nova's creative core. Her vision was fearless, her art emotionally charged. She could translate Imani's most abstract concepts into color, movement, and light. One afternoon, as they reviewed a campaign for a wellness brand, Maya looked up from her sketchpad and said, "You know, people don't just come to us for strategy. They come because they want to feel something again." Imani smiled. "Then we're doing our job." Devin Lee, their quiet strategist, had become the grounding force of the company. His calm intellect balanced Maya's fire and Imani's intuition. He could take chaos and turn it into data, dreams into deadlines. But beneath his analytical surface was a surprising tenderness. One evening, after a long day, he left a small note on Imani's desk that read, "Remember, you're allowed to rest too." She never mentioned it aloud, but she kept the note folded inside her journal. Ruth Delgado, her oldest friend and fiercest protector, had become Nova's legal counsel and unofficial conscience. Her presence in meetings was like steel wrapped in silk, measured, articulate, unflinching. When investors questioned the ethics of one of their social campaigns, Ruth cut through the noise with a single sentence. "Integrity is not a brand strategy. It's the foundation of one." Imani often thought Ruth had the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, steady as gravity. Then came Julien Moreau, the French creative director from their breakthrough campaign. He arrived in New York one rainy evening to propose a long-term partnership with Nova. They met at a small bar in the West Village, its lights dim and its jazz soft. Julian's charm was effortless, his presence disarming. "You've created something rare," he told her, swirling the wine in his glass. "Your agency doesn't sell beauty, it restores it." Imani tilted her head, studying him. "And what does that make you? A patron?" Julian smiled faintly. "No, I think I'm just a believer." Their collaboration deepened quickly, both professionally and, though neither dared name it, personally. There was an ease between them, a mutual respect untainted by expectation. He challenged her ideas, not her worth. When they worked side by side, the air seemed to hum differently, sharper, more alive. And yet, Imani was cautious. She had rebuilt herself from ruin. She wasn't sure she was ready to hand her heart to anyone again. Still, when Julian brushed her hand one evening while reviewing concepts, the touch lingered just long enough to remind her that she was still human, still capable of feeling warmth without fear. As Nova's influence grew, so did the attention. Major publications began to call her the voice of ethical luxury. Universities invited her to speak. Brands that had once ignored her now lined up to collaborate. But with visibility came risk. A quiet storm was gathering beneath the surface. Rumors, whispers, the occasional question veiled in politeness. Wasn't she Ethan Caldwell's ex-wife? Didn't she have help getting started? One morning, as she entered the office, Ruth was waiting by her desk, a file in her hand. "It's starting," Ruth said simply. "The Caldwell's PR team is planning stories again. They're trying to reclaim the narrative before you get too powerful." Imani inhaled deeply, setting her coffee down. "Of course they are." Ruth's eyes softened. "You don't have to engage. You're winning. Let your silence speak." But silence had never been Imani's language. That afternoon, she gathered her team. The energy in the room shifted when she spoke. Low, steady, deliberate. "They're trying to remind the world of who I was," she said, "but we'll remind it of who we are." She unveiled their next campaign, a project months in the making. Reclaim, a global initiative spotlighting creators, especially women, who had lost credit, recognition, or power in industries built on their brilliance. It wasn't about her, not directly, but everyone in the room understood. When Reclaim launched, it resonated like thunder. Artists, writers, and entrepreneurs from around the world shared their stories. The campaign became a movement, spreading across social media, reshaping conversations about ownership and authorship. Imani's name was everywhere again, but this time not as someone's ex-wife. She was a leader, a catalyst, a force. One evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings, she returned to the office to find Julian waiting by the window. The city glowed behind him, the skyline a constellation of ambition. "You've done it," he said quietly. "You've changed the narrative." Imani smiled, her eyes tired but luminous. "No, Julian, we're just rewriting it." He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "And what about you, Imani? When will you start rewriting your own story?" She looked out at the city, the same city that had once broken her, now rebuilt in her reflection. "I already am," she whispered. Julian didn't press further. He simply reached for her hand, and for once, she didn't pull away. The night held its breath around them. Outside, the lights of New York shimmered like stars fallen to earth. Proof that even in a city built on ruin and reinvention, some stories didn't end when they broke. They began again, stronger. And this time, Imani wasn't just surviving. She was designing the world that had once tried to silence her. Brick by brick, word by word, truth by truth. The rain came first, soft at dawn, relentless by noon. It tapped against the tall windows of Nova's Chelsea office, a rhythm that matched the tension settling in Imani's chest. The city outside was blurred, a watercolor of gray and motion. Inside, everything was too still. Ruth Delgado stood by the window, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. When she finally turned to face Imani, her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of truth. "They've filed the lawsuit," Ruth said quietly. Imani didn't move. The words hung between them like thunder waiting to break. "On what grounds?" she asked. "Intellectual property, defamation. They're claiming Nova was built using proprietary ideas from Caldwell Creative." Imani let out a sharp exhale. Disbelief, fury, exhaustion all colliding in one breath. "That's absurd. Everything Nova does is original. Every file, every design, every client." "I know," Ruth interrupted gently, "but this isn't about truth. It's about intimidation." Imani turned away, walking toward the wide windows, her reflection fractured by raindrops. "He's not done with me." "No," Ruth said, setting the phone down on the desk. "But he's desperate." That's different. By evening, the news had broken. The Caldwell Foundation files suit against Nova Strategies. Allegations of idea theft rock NYC's newest rising agency. Every headline carried Ethan's name beside hers, binding them once again. Not in marriage this time, but in conflict. The irony made her laugh once, bitterly, before silence reclaimed her. Her team gathered in the conference room, their faces pale but determined. Devin had his laptop open, scanning documents. Maya sat with arms crossed, eyes flashing with anger. "They're trying to drown us in paperwork," Devin said. "The claims are vague, but they're heavy enough to slow down investors." "It's reputation warfare," Maya added. "They know perception is currency." Imani listened, her hands clasped on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but unwavering. "Then we don't panic. We prepare." She looked at Ruth. "How bad is it?" Ruth hesitated. "They've got resources. Lawyers who bill more in an hour than most people make in a month. But they don't have what we have." "What's that?" Maya asked. Ruth smiled faintly. "Truth. And a woman who refuses to be erased twice." The next weeks blurred into a battle, fought in glass towers and courtrooms. Ethan's team unleashed wave after wave of filings, claims, injunctions, demands for discovery. It was legal warfare by attrition, designed to exhaust her. But Imani did not bend. She sat through every deposition, her posture immaculate, her tone controlled. When their lawyers tried to provoke her, she met their smirks with silence sharp enough to draw blood. The woman who had once been told to soften her voice now wielded it with precision. Ethan, of course, was there, Always immaculate, always rehearsed. Seeing him again after all those months was like facing a ghost carved from arrogance and memory. The first time they locked eyes across the table, time seemed to twist. He looked older, harder, his smile too deliberate. Still as dramatic as ever, he murmured during a recess, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Imani turned her gaze toward him, unflinching. Still mistaking cruelty for charm, I see, he chuckled softly. You can't win this, Imani. You're playing in my world now. She leaned closer, her words a whisper that cut like ice. That's where you're wrong. I built my own. When she walked away, Ethan's mask cracked, just for a second, and Ruth saw it. Later in the hallway, she said quietly, He's terrified of you. Good, Imani replied. He should be. The pressure mounted as the case dragged on. Investors paused their contracts, journalists speculated, and the whispers began again. Was Nova a fraud? Was Imani's rise too good to be true? At night, she would return to her apartment, peel off her heels, and sit by the window overlooking the harbor. Some nights she cried, silently, fiercely, privately. But she never let the tears last long. They were a luxury she could no longer afford. Julien called often from Paris, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to remind her that storms, no matter how violent, eventually pass. You are not fighting for revenge, he told her once. You are fighting for the right to exist as yourself. That is the hardest and most noble battle of all. She didn't tell him, but those words carried her through the darkest hours. One afternoon, Ruth arrived at the office with a thin smile and a thick file. They overplayed their hand, she said, setting it down before Imani. We found internal communications from Caldwell Creative, proof that your campaigns were stolen, not theirs. We can counterclaim. Imani stared at her, disbelief giving way to slow, deliberate relief. You're sure? Ruth's eyes gleamed, positive. You didn't just build Nova clean, you built it better, and they can't stand it. For the first time in weeks, Imani laughed. Not softly, but deeply, from somewhere that still remembered joy. The counterclaim changed everything. The media narrative shifted overnight. New evidence emerges in Caldwell case. Nova Strategies accuses Caldwell Foundation of exploiting black creatives. Ethan's empire began to crack under the weight of scrutiny. The same journalists who once adored him now dissected his hypocrisy with surgical delight. Investors backed away. Invitations disappeared. In court, his confidence faltered. Imani watched, serene, as he stammered through testimony, his perfect composure unraveling. She did not smile. Victory was not something she wanted to taste, only justice. When the final ruling came, it was clear. The case was dismissed with prejudice. Nova was vindicated. The Caldwells were fined for misconduct. Outside the courthouse, flashes erupted, microphones thrust forward. But Imani said little. Only that I didn't win today because I fought harder. I won because I refused to be silent. Her words echoed across the news cycle, played and replayed until they became more than a statement. They became a standard. That night, back in her office, the storm had passed. The city glowed again, alive and unbroken. Ruth raised a glass of wine. Maya and Devin joined her. Laughter filled the room like light. Imani stood by the window, watching the rain fade to mist. She thought of the girl she once was, the one who'd believed silence was safety, that love could be earned through endurance. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced the storm and learned to command the thunder. And as the first stars broke through the clearing sky, Imani Carter whispered to herself, not in triumph, but in truth. I didn't rebuild to prove I was right. I rebuilt to prove I could never be erased again. The Caldwell estate had always been a monument to perfection. Manicured lawns trimmed to symmetry, the marble steps polished until they reflected the sky. But in the weeks following the court's verdict, even the air there seemed heavier, the silence sharper. The house that once hosted senators, philanthropists, and headlines now stood like a mausoleum of fading grandeur. Inside, Margaret Caldwell sat in the drawing room, her fingers wrapped tightly around a teacup that had gone cold hours ago. She stared at the muted television across the room, where the newscaster's voice filled the air with unbearable clarity. In a decisive victory, the court has ruled in favor of Nova Strategies, effectively dismissing all claims by the Caldwell Foundation. Evidence presented during the proceedings revealed misuse of creative assets under the Caldwell name. Margaret turned off the television. Her reflection flickered in the dark screen. Immaculate hair, pearls at her throat, eyes lined with exhaustion. She had spent her entire life cultivating the illusion of order, of untouchable grace. Now, everything she'd built trembled beneath the weight of her son's arrogance. From the hallway came the sharp echo of footsteps. Ethan's voice followed, agitated, defensive, laced with a desperation she hadn't heard before. "I told you, Mother, it's temporary. The media always turns." "Stop." Her voice was soft, but it silenced him immediately. Ethan entered the room, his suit disheveled, tie loose, eyes red-rimmed. The charm he'd once worn like armor had dulled, leaving behind something brittle. He sank into the chair opposite her, rubbing his temples. "Do you have any idea how much damage this has done?" she asked, her tone precise, almost surgical. "The Foundation's donors are fleeing. The board is in chaos. Your father—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted, his voice cracking. "Don't bring him into this. Your father's reputation is what built your world," she said coldly. "And now you've dragged it through the mud over a woman you couldn't control." He flinched. "She lied." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "No, Ethan," she fought. "There's a difference." He rose abruptly, pacing the room. "You don't understand. She humiliated me, publicly. I gave her everything, and she—" "You gave her nothing," Margaret snapped, her composure finally fracturing. "You tried to own her, and when she refused, you called it betrayal." The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light flickering across the walls lined with family portraits. Generations of poised Caldwells staring down like silent judges. Ethan sank back into the chair, his voice barely audible. "She's destroying me." Margaret's tone softened, though the steel beneath remained. "No, Ethan. You're destroying yourself. She's simply reminding the world who you are." He looked up at her, anger returning to his eyes. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" She let out a slow breath, weary and elegant. "No, I'm mourning it. I raised you to be powerful, not cruel, to lead, not to conquer." Her words hit him harder than any accusation could. For a moment, he looked like the boy she once knew, lost, frightened, still searching for the approval he'd been promised but never truly earned. In another part of the estate, the staff moved quietly, whispering about canceled charity galas and closed accounts. The once bustling kitchens were half-staffed. The sound of laughter that used to echo from garden parties had been replaced by the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the coast. When the first magazine cover appeared, The Fall of the Caldwells, Power, Scandal, and the Woman Who Fought Back. Margaret had ordered every copy in the house removed, but the image lingered in her mind. Imani Carter, poised and luminous, standing outside the courthouse in her tailored suit, sunlight glinting in her hair. She had looked like victory itself. It wasn't just defeat that stung. It was the knowledge that Imani had built something genuine, while the Caldwells' legacy crumbled under pretense. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the first time she met Imani, the poised young woman with fire behind her composure. She had dismissed her then as ambitious, naive, too vibrant for the Caldwell world. Now, she realized she had underestimated her, and Ethan had destroyed the only person who might have saved him from himself. A week later, the boardroom of the Caldwell Foundation was chaos. The directors, men who had once nodded deferentially at Ethan's every word, now avoided his gaze. "Public confidence has collapsed," one of them said sharply. "We've lost half our donors. The museum partnership is frozen. We can't afford another scandal." "I said I'll fix it," Ethan snapped. Another voice, colder. "You can't fix integrity, Ethan. You can only earn it. And right now no one believes you have any left." When he stormed out, his reflection in the glass walls was almost unrecognizable. The sheen of success replaced by the raw edges of failure. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters shouted questions as he pushed through them, jaw clenched, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have a statement? Was the lawsuit an act of retaliation? Have you spoken to Miss Carter?" He didn't answer, but the last question lingered longest. Had he spoken to her? number, and he wouldn't. Because what could he possibly say to the woman who had seen through him and survived? That night, the estate was quiet again. Margaret stood alone in the garden, the air cool against her skin. The roses, her pride, were beginning to wilt under the season's first chill. Ethan appeared behind her, his voice softer now. "They're saying we might have to sell the house." Margaret didn't turn. "Then let it go. A house is only worth what's built inside it, and ours has nothing left." He was silent for a long time. Then, almost inaudibly, "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" Margaret looked out at the dark horizon, the distant line where sky met sea. "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve, Ethan. It's something you earn, and I don't think you've begun." Her words lingered in the cool air long after she left him standing among the dying roses. Ethan looked down at his hands, hands that had once held everything, now trembling, empty. Somewhere, far away, the city still spoke her name, and for the first time in his life, he understood what loss really meant. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was the silence that came when the one person who once believed in you had finally learned to live without you. The air in New York had turned softer with spring, that brief, forgiving season when even the city seemed to remember how to breathe. The streets glittered after rain, tulips opened in narrow park beds, and from the terrace of Nova Strategy's Chelsea office, the skyline looked like a promise fulfilled. Imani Carter stood there one evening, the sunset gilding her profile. The storm of the lawsuit had passed, and with it, the last thread that tethered her to Ethan's shadow. Nova was thriving. Her name, her own name, now stood for something more than survival. It stood for truth, resilience, and renewal. Still, even victory had its silences. She watched the reflection of the city in her glass, the fading gold mirrored across the high windows. Behind her, laughter drifted from the office. Maya and Devin arguing over music for their latest campaign, Ruth half teasing them while reviewing contracts. It was a sound she loved, the hum of purpose made human. Yet a small part of her stood apart from it all. Not lonely, but aware. Something was shifting. That night, when she returned to her apartment overlooking the harbor, she found an envelope waiting by her door. Heavy cream paper, no return address. The handwriting, elegant, deliberate, sent a small jolt through her chest before she even read it. She tore it open with steady hands. "Miss Carter, the Whitmore Foundation requests the honor of your attendance at this year's Gala of Progress, to be held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You are invited as a featured speaker on the theme, Women Who Shape the Future." Her breath caught. The Whitmore Gala, the same stage she had once attended as a silent ornament beside her husband. The same event where her laughter had once been a performance, her presence a prop. And now she was being asked to stand there, alone, in her own right, as one of the voices shaping the future. She let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the paper. For a moment, the irony felt too sharp to swallow, but beneath it was something gentler, a quiet, almost trembling pride. She placed the invitation on her desk and stared at it long after the city lights began to blur. The next morning, Ruth walked into her office and stopped short at the sight of it. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked, arching a brow. Imani nodded, her expression unreadable. "The Whitmore Gala. I've been invited to speak." Ruth let out a low whistle. "Well, the universe has a wicked sense of symmetry." Maya burst through the door a moment later, holding a coffee the size of her ambition. "Wait, the Whitmore Gala? As in, the Whitmore Gala, where the elite go to pretend they have hearts?" "The very same," Imani said, her tone laced with amusement. Maya grinned. "So, what are you going to wear when you ruin them?" Ruth shot her a look. "She's not going to ruin them. She's going to outshine them." Imani smiled faintly. "No, I'm going to remind them." That evening, after the office emptied, Imani stayed behind. The invitation sat open on her desk, next to a glass of red wine and her mother's photograph, the one she always kept close. "Can you believe it?" she whispered softly to the smiling face in the frame. "I used to think walking into that world meant I'd made it. Now I know I had to leave it to find myself." The city hummed below her window, alive with its endless stories. She thought about the last time she had stood under those chandeliers, the scent of wealth and deceit heavy in the air. Ethan's hand firm on her back as cameras flashed. She remembered how she'd smiled for photographs she didn't believe in, laughed at jokes that cut her to the bone, and she remembered walking away. The sound of her heels against marble, the taste of salt and defiance in her mouth, the first breath of freedom as she stepped into the night. That memory no longer hurt. It glowed. Now she would walk back through those same doors, not as someone's wife, but as the woman who had burned down her own cage and built something new from the ashes. A week later, the preparations began. Maya insisted on helping her choose an outfit, declaring it a mission of poetic revenge. They spent an afternoon in a sunlit boutique, fabric draped across mannequins like soft armor. Finally, Imani found it. A gown of deep sapphire silk, its design minimalist yet commanding. It moved when she walked, not as a statement of luxury, but of freedom. When she stood before the mirror, she saw not glamour, but sovereignty. Julien called from Paris that evening. His voice was warm, teasing. "So, ma chère, I hear New York is preparing for your coronation." "Hardly," she said, smiling. "It's just another stage." "Non," he murmured. "It's the same stage, but a different queen." She felt her heart flutter in a way that surprised her. Gently, like a door opening where she thought there was only a wall. As the evening of the gala approached, the media began to stir. Her attendance was announced in press releases, her photo appearing in glossy spreads beside words like visionary and trailblazer. Yet what captured attention most was the symmetry of it all. The woman once silenced at the Whitmore Gala, now returning as its voice. Ethan, inevitably, saw it too. In the dim light of his now muted penthouse, he scrolled through the article, her image staring back at him from the screen. There was no bitterness in her expression, only calm, radiant composure. It was the face of someone who had made peace with the past by mastering it. He set the tablet down and stared out over the city that had once adored him. The silence of his phone was deafening. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in gold and expectation. Black cars lined Fifth Avenue, their doors opening to silk, tuxedos, and whispered ambition. Inside, the marble halls glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. When Imani entered, the crowd stilled. For a moment, it was as though the entire room inhaled. She walked through the foyer with quiet confidence, her gown trailing behind her like a ripple of night. The flash of cameras followed her, but she didn't look toward them. Her eyes stayed forward, toward the grand staircase, toward the stage where she would soon speak. Somewhere in the crowd, she caught a glimpse of familiar faces. Journalists, former colleagues, even a few from the Caldwell circle who quickly averted their eyes. But she didn't stop. When she reached the base of the stairs, she paused, the murmur of the room folding around her. It was here, years ago, that she had first felt herself disappearing. It was here, now, that she began to fully exist. And as the orchestra began to play, the music swelling like a heartbeat reborn, Imani Carter ascended the staircase. Each step was a chapter reclaimed, each breath a new beginning. The invitation that had once symbolized her submission had become something else entirely, a summons, not to return to the past, but to transform it. And for the first time in her life, she was walking not toward approval, but toward destiny. The invitation sat framed on her desk now, not out of vanity, but as a reminder. A single piece of heavy cream paper that carried a quiet gravity, proof that life, when it came full circle, did so not in revenge, but in reclamation. The Whitmore Gala, the night that once marked her undoing, would soon mark her rebirth. Yet, Imani Carter didn't see it as a stage to conquer. She saw it as an altar, one where she would lay down the last remnants of her old self and finally step into her new skin. Still, even for the most composed woman, there were ghosts in preparation. The days leading up to the gala unfolded in soft, deliberate rhythms. Mornings began early at the Nova office, sunlight pouring through glass and steel, while her team buzzed around her with both pride and protectiveness. Maya had turned the corner by Imani's office into a makeshift mood board. Pinned sketches of gowns, color palettes, even snippets of poetry she claimed felt like your aura. Ruth balanced between legal meetings and personal counsel, reminding Imani with dry humor to smile at the donors, but never trust the compliments. Julien called daily from Paris, his voice smooth and grounding. He was coming to New York for the gala, officially as a collaborator, unofficially as something more undefined, yet quietly growing. "You must be calm," he told her one evening over video call. "Don't let them sense nerves. They feed on hesitation." Imani smiled faintly. "They'll sense power before they sense nerves." "Ah," he said, his lips curving. "Then New York has no idea what it's about to witness." But for all her composure, there were moments when stillness crept in. Moments when memory pressed too close. Late at night, after the city had folded into its quiet hum, Imani often found herself sitting before her vanity, the same one she'd taken from the apartment she had shared with Ethan. It was the only object she had brought, a deliberate act of reclamation. She'd replaced the mirror once shattered by grief. Now, when she looked into it, she saw no trace of the woman who had once rehearsed her smiles there. One evening, she found herself tracing the edge of the mirror with her fingertips, whispering softly, "You're not going back there. You're walking through it." The reflection smiled back, not with fragility, but with certainty. Her gown arrived 2 days before the gala, wrapped in ivory paper, folded with reverence. Designed in collaboration with Julian's atelier, it was a masterpiece of restraint and symbolism. Deep sapphire silk, cut with modern precision, draped elegantly across her shoulders. Its backline, bold and clean, exposed the grace of her spine, strength without excess. When she tried it on, Maya stood behind her, eyes wide. "You look like poetry," she whispered. Imani turned toward the mirror. The gown didn't just fit, it belonged. Every line seemed to echo the woman she had become, deliberate, unflinching, luminous without apology. "Julian said you'd know the moment you put it on," Maya added, smiling. He was right. Imani ran a hand down the silk, her voice soft. "He understands fabric the way I understand silence. Both can speak when you know how to listen." The night before the gala, she stayed late at the office, alone. The city outside glimmered like a sea of fractured stars. On her desk lay her speech, pages of words she had written and rewritten until they no longer felt like statements, but confessions. It wasn't a speech about triumph or victory. It was about reclamation, of identity, of voice, of worth. It was about what it meant to rise, not despite the world's cruelty, but through it. She read it aloud once, the sound of her voice filling the empty office. When she finished, she closed her eyes and imagined the hall, the chandeliers, the hush of silk, the eyes that once looked at her with judgment, now waiting for her words. She didn't feel fear. She felt alignment. This time, she wouldn't be entering their world. They would be stepping into hers. That same evening, across the Atlantic, Julian was packing his suitcase. He paused when he came across a small photograph he'd taken of Imani months ago in Maine. Her standing at the edge of the ocean, wind pulling at her hair, gaze fixed on the horizon. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without a second thought. He would never tell her, but that image had changed him. He had met hundreds of powerful women in his world of fashion and art, but Imani's power was different. Quiet, principled, earned. It was the kind of beauty that demanded reverence, not possession. Back in New York, Ruth stopped by Imani's apartment just before midnight. She brought tea, as she always did when she sensed her friend's thoughts wandering too far inward. "You ready?" Ruth asked, settling into the armchair across from her. Imani nodded, but her voice was thoughtful. "It feels strange, coming full circle. The same room, the same chandeliers, but everything's changed." Ruth smiled knowingly. "Not everything. The difference is, last time you were trying to fit into that room. This time, you'll own it." Imani looked up. "And what if I see him there?" Ruth didn't flinch. "Then you do what you've always done. Stand taller." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The kind of silence that held history and healing in equal measure. When Ruth left, Imani lingered by the window. The city lights flickered below, and the river reflected the moon in silver fragments. She thought of every step that had led her here, the heartbreak, the rebuilding, the faith it took to believe in her own name again. Tomorrow, she would return to the very place her voice had been diminished. Only this time, it would fill the room. The morning of the gala arrived with an early spring rain. It drummed softly against the glass as Imani prepared, each movement unhurried, ritualistic. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air. Her makeup was subtle, Her hair swept into a simple knot that framed her face with effortless grace. When she finally slipped into the gown, the fabric felt like armor. Not the kind forged in steel, but in peace. The kind that came from surviving everything meant to silence her. Standing before the mirror, she fastened a single pair of earrings, the same ones her mother had worn on her first gallery opening night. "You got me here," she whispered to the reflection. The city was waiting, the gala was waiting, and somewhere within that shimmering crowd, her past waited too. But Imani Carter no longer trembled before her history. She was its author now. Steady hand, clear heart, unshakable grace. Ready to walk once more into the glittering halls where she had once been invisible. And this time, let the entire world remember her name. The night unfolded like liquid gold poured over the city. Fifth Avenue shimmered beneath a constellation of headlights, black cars gliding toward the Metropolitan Museum like a slow procession of privilege. Inside, the marble halls of the Whitmore Foundation Gala glowed with opulence. Crystal chandeliers suspended like frozen constellations. Laughter polished to perfection, and a symphony quartet playing Vivaldi so delicately it sounded rehearsed by angels. And then, beneath the glittering tide of society's finest, she arrived. Imani Carter. The doors opened, and the hum of conversation faltered. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Heads turned. The hush that followed was the kind of silence reserved for moments people know they will remember. She stepped through the entrance with a quiet grace that carried more power than any grand announcement could. Her gown of deep sapphire silk caught the light with every movement, shifting like the sea beneath moonlight. There was no crown on her head, yet she carried herself like a queen who no longer needed one. It had been years since she last walked these floors. The marble remembered her footsteps. The chandeliers remembered her tears. Back then, she had stood in the same room as a wife, a trophy, a silent participant in someone else's empire. Tonight, she returned as an architect of her own. The transformation was not theatrical, it was spiritual. As she crossed the grand foyer, the familiar scent of white lilies and champagne wrapped around her. The orchestra swelled. She could feel the eyes on her, curious, startled, reverent. But she moved as though she were walking through a dream she had already mastered. Margaret Caldwell saw her first. Across the room, the matriarch of the Caldwell family stood beside a group of old donors, her posture as rigid as ever, her pearls gleaming like armor. When her gaze found Imani, the conversation around her dissolved into static. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then Margaret inclined her head, barely, but enough. It was not quite apology, not quite surrender. It was acknowledgement. Imani returned the gesture with poise, a soft, wordless grace that carried no bitterness. That was the cruelest mercy of all. Forgiveness offered where none had been earned. Moments later, the air shifted again. Ethan. He was standing near the grand staircase, just as he had years ago. But time had rewritten him, his edges dulled by defeat, his charm hollowed by loss. The tailored suit still fit, but the confidence inside it did not. He turned when the murmurs rippled through the crowd, and when his eyes found her, the room seemed to dissolve. She was real, not the woman he remembered, not the ghost he'd tried to bury beneath scandal, but the living embodiment of everything he had underestimated. He felt the air leave his lungs. The sight of her ignited something painful, an ache that reached far beyond regret. He took a step forward, instinct overriding reason. Imani didn't move. She simply watched him, her gaze calm and unreadable. There was no anger left, only understanding, and in some ways that hurt him more. He stopped halfway between them, his voice low, almost breaking. "You look alive?" she offered softly. He blinked, shame flickering across his face. "Different." "No," she said, her tone even. "I'm the same woman you tried to silence. You just never really saw me." Her words were gentle, but they landed like thunder. Before he could speak again, a hand rested on her shoulder. Julian Moreau had arrived quietly, dressed in an impeccably tailored tuxedo, his presence commanding yet unintrusive. He greeted Ethan with a courteous nod that held no warmth, then turned to Imani with a soft smile. "The board is ready," he murmured. Imani nodded once and turned away from Ethan, her movement effortless, final. He stood there, frozen in a world that no longer belonged to him, as she ascended the same staircase where she had once followed him in silence. Now the crowd followed her. The ballroom at the top of the stairs was a sea of candlelight and expectancy. At the center stood the podium, framed by an arch of orchids and gold. Her name glowed across the large screen above it. Imani Carter, founder, Nova Strategies, women who shape the future. As she took the stage, the room hushed again. The echo of her heels against marble was the only sound, a metronome marking the rhythm of destiny. She stood before them, poised yet unguarded, the embodiment of grace reclaimed. Her gaze swept over the audience. Faces that had once dismissed her, whispered about her, forgotten her. She could see their discomfort in the stillness of their posture, their awe in the way they leaned forward without meaning to. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was low, warm, steady. "Years ago, I stood in this very room for the first time. I remember the light, the laughter, the music, and the silence." A pause. The words hung there, deliberate. In that silence, I learned something. I learned that the absence of voice isn't peace, it's erasure. And for too long, I accepted it. Until one day, I didn't. The room seemed to lean closer. Even the music had stopped breathing. I lost everything I thought defined me. But in losing it, I found something far more powerful, myself. I learned that power is not the privilege of those born into it, but the right of those who build it, brick by brick, with truth. Her tone softened, becoming intimate. Tonight isn't about triumph. It's about return. Not to this room, but to oneself. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like the slow rise of a tide, applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling, thunderous. Imani inclined her head, her smile tender but assured. She glanced toward the crowd, catching Ruth's proud expression, Maya's tears, Devon's steady nod. And somewhere, near the edge of the room, Ethan watched her with the hollow realization that she had become everything he could never be. Free. Julian joined her on stage, standing slightly behind her, his presence protective, but not possessive. When their eyes met, she felt the faintest flicker of warmth, something not born of rescue, but recognition. As the applause continued, she turned her gaze back to the audience, her heart steady. Years ago, she had walked out of this world broken and invisible. Tonight, she had walked back into it whole. And as the orchestra began to play again, Imani Carter stepped down from the podium, her gown whispering across the marble like the sound of closure, and of something new beginning just beyond it. The past had been a wound. Tonight it became history. For a brief, suspended moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. The air in the grand hall felt charged, an invisible current that pulsed from the marble floors to the chandeliers shimmering above. 1,000 eyes fixed on the woman standing beneath their glow. And in that stillness, even the orchestra stopped breathing. Imani Carter stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edge, her sapphire gown glinting like midnight water. But it wasn't the gown, nor the stage, nor the gilded grandeur that drew the room toward her. It was the gravity of her silence. Every person there could feel it. The quiet was not hesitation. It was power. Then she spoke. "When I was a girl," she began softly, her voice steady and intimate, "I was taught that silence was elegance, that composure meant swallowing the words that trembled at the edge of your throat. I carried that lesson for years, through school, through love, through rooms like this one, where I learned to smile instead of speak." Her gaze swept across the audience. Politicians, CEOs, benefactors, all of them still. But silence is a funny thing. It can look like grace from the outside and feel like suffocation from within. And one day, you realize you've built an entire life around the parts of yourself you were too afraid to show. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the faint sound of people shifting in their seats, caught between discomfort and reflection. "I used to think survival meant being acceptable," she continued, "that to belong in certain spaces you had to fold yourself into shapes that made others comfortable. But belonging built on erasure isn't belonging at all. It's captivity." She paused. Her eyes, warm and resolute, found Ruth among the audience. A small nod passed between them. Shared history turned into fuel. "When my world collapsed," Imani said quietly, "I thought I'd lost everything. My marriage, my home, my place in the world. But what I'd really lost was illusion, and what I found in its place was truth. Now the room was utterly silent, drawn to the rhythm of her words. I learned that when you lose the things that were never meant to define you, what remains is what was always meant to last. Your voice, your integrity, your purpose. Her tone deepened, her conviction blooming in every word. We live in a world where power has been dressed in the same suit for centuries, where too many of us are told we must wait to be invited to the table. But here's what they don't tell you. You can build your own. There was a low gasp from someone near the front, a raw sound, human and unguarded. Imani smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with tenderness. I built mine, brick by brick, with the hands of those who refuse to be forgotten, artists, thinkers, visionaries who believed that the truth, once spoken, could outlast the empire of silence. Her voice softened. Tonight, I don't stand here to celebrate success. I stand here to honor survival, not as endurance, but as transformation. Because survival, at its best, is the art of turning pain into architecture. The line lingered in the air like perfume. From somewhere at the edge of the room, the lights shifted slightly, illuminating her from behind. For a moment, her shadow stretched long across the marble floor, a reminder that even the brightest light is born from darkness. She took a slow breath. To every woman who has been told she is too bold, too ambitious, too much, know this: the world has never been changed by those who were careful. It has been changed by those who were courageous. The room stirred again, an audible swell of emotion. Even the most stoic faces began to soften, their armor cracking in the glow of her words. I stand before you, not as someone who won, she said, her voice now intimate again, like confession. I stand as someone who refused to lose herself. That is the truest victory of all. She let her gaze travel through the room, resting briefly on familiar faces. Maya, eyes wet with pride. Devon, hands clasped tightly. Julian, whose expression held both admiration and something quieter, deeper. And then, inevitably, her eyes met Ethan's. He stood at the back of the hall, partially shadowed. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. But in his stillness, she saw it, the breaking. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. For the first time, he was seeing her clearly. She didn't linger on him. She didn't need to. Her story had already outgrown him. I used to believe I had to earn love, she said softly, her gaze lifting toward the crowd again. But what I know now is that love, like purpose, isn't something you earn. It's something you reclaim. The same way you reclaim your name, your worth, your place in the world. There it was, the shift. The moment when the speech stopped being hers alone. She could feel it, the energy in the room bending, rising, alive. Her final words came with the cadence of truth, quiet but unshakable. May we never confuse acceptance with freedom. May we never trade authenticity for belonging. And may we remember that our voices, our unbroken, unapologetic voices, are not what make us different. They are what make us divine. The silence that followed was immense. Then it shattered into applause. Thunderous, standing, unrestrained. The kind that comes not from performance, but revelation. Imani stood there, composed yet luminous, allowing the sound to wash over her like a tide. She didn't smile widely or bow grandly. She simply placed a hand over her heart, a gesture of gratitude, not victory. As she stepped away from the podium, Julian was waiting near the steps. He didn't speak, only reached out his hand. She took it, their fingers brushed, an unspoken acknowledgement that some connections are born from shared courage. Ethan was gone. She didn't look for him. Outside, as she stepped into the night, the city met her with a warm wind. The Met's marble steps gleamed under the streetlights, and the moon, pale and wide above the skyline, seemed to lean closer. For the first time, the night didn't feel heavy. It felt infinite. Her words would travel far beyond this hall. They would find women in boardrooms, in studios, in quiet corners of the world where courage was still whispered rather than spoken. And though she didn't know it yet, this night, this speech, would become something more than a moment. It would become a movement. Because Imani Carter hadn't just told her story. She had rewritten what strength could sound like. The city woke the next morning, as it always did, restless, shimmering, alive. But something in its rhythm had changed. Headlines flooded the streets, digital billboards flickered with her image, and social feeds pulsed with fragments of her words. Our voices are what make us divine. Her speech from the Whitmore Gala had spread beyond the marble halls that birthed it, echoing through boardrooms, classrooms, living rooms, anywhere women had once learned to whisper instead of speak. In coffee shops, young creatives quoted her lines to each other over steaming cups. In offices, executives forwarded recordings of her talk with subject lines like, "You need to hear this." Even in quiet kitchens across the country, mothers played her words for their daughters, their faces soft with something between hope and recognition. And somewhere, on the other side of the city, Ethan Caldwell watched it all unfold on a muted screen. He sat alone in the same penthouse that once symbolized victory. Now it was a museum of silence, polished, lifeless, immaculate. Her voice played softly through the speakers, carrying warmth into the cold corners of his world. When she said, "Survival is the art of turning pain into architecture," he turned the volume off. He didn't need to hear it again. He was living in the architecture of his own undoing. But Imani Carter, she was building something entirely new. Months passed. Nova Strategies became more than an agency. It became a movement. Imani began partnering with universities to mentor young entrepreneurs, especially women of color who had been told their ideas were too bold, too emotional, too different. She spoke at the United Nations, then at Harvard, then at a global innovation summit in Seoul. Each time she carried the same message, that authenticity was not a weakness but a revolution. Her team grew, and so did her circle of allies. Ruth expanded their legal branch to offer free guidance to underrepresented founders. Maya's designs were now exhibited in museums. Devin became the quiet visionary behind Nova's research foundation, studying how diversity fuels creativity. Julian stayed by her side, never eclipsing, always complementing. They worked together often, their partnership balancing art and intellect, heart and strategy. Their connection deepened into something unspoken yet undeniable. Not a love born from rescue, but from recognition. Together they launched the Nova Fellowship, a global initiative funding projects by women rebuilding their lives after loss. Women who, like Imani once had, were learning to create from the rubble. She often said to her team, "I don't want Nova to just exist. I want it to outlive me." And quietly, it already was. But legacy isn't built only in grand gestures. It's born in the smallest, most human moments, the ones that no camera captures. One evening, Imani visited her mother's old art studio in Harlem. It had been years since she'd stepped through those doors. The space was dusty now, the paint-splattered floor frozen in time. But the smell of turpentine and oil colors was the same. She walked slowly to the window, where her mother's easel still stood. On it was a half-finished canvas, a portrait of a woman standing in the rain, her face lifted toward the light. Imani traced the edge of the brushstrokes and smiled. "You were painting me before I even knew who I was," she whispered. Then she sat down at the old stool and picked up a brush. For hours she painted, not perfectly but freely. When she finally stepped back, she saw it. The woman her mother had begun now had a completed face. Strong, radiant, at peace. It wasn't just art. It was inheritance. That summer, Nova hosted its first international summit in Lisbon. Hundreds of creators and entrepreneurs gathered under vaulted ceilings overlooking the sea. The event's final night was illuminated by hundreds of lanterns released into the evening sky, each one carrying a handwritten word of intention. Imani stood on the balcony as the lanterns rose, her heart quiet but full. Julian came to stand beside her, his voice low. "Do you ever stop to realize what you've done?" She turned to him, her smile soft. "I didn't do it alone." He nodded, his gaze steady. "That's what makes it a legacy." She looked back at the sky, watching the lights drift upward until they disappeared among the stars. The wind off the Atlantic carried the faint hum of laughter and song from the courtyard below. For a moment, everything was still. The past, the present, the endless unfolding of what came next. She exhaled slowly. "Legacy," she murmured, almost to herself. isn't about being remembered. It's about what continues when you no longer need to be. Julianne reached for her hand. She let him. In the months that followed, people continued to quote her speech, but Imani no longer chased its echo. She was already on to the next chapter, mentoring, creating, building quietly behind the noise. Her joy now came from seeing others rise, from watching the world tilt ever so slightly toward fairness, toward truth. Sometimes, when she walked home late at night, she would glance at her reflection in the city's glass towers. A woman who had once been erased, now mirrored in the light of her own making. And she would smile. Because she had learned that legacy is not carved in marble or written in stone. It lives in the courage we pass forward, in the hands that build after ours, the voices that rise because ours did. So if you're reading this, listening to her story, or feeling its weight somewhere deep inside you, remember this. Your silence was never a flaw. It was a pause. Your pain was never a prison. It was a passage. And your story, yes, yours, is already part of this legacy. Because every time one person stands up and says, "I will not disappear," the world changes shape. Every voice matters. Every truth echoes. Every beginning starts with a choice to rise. So rise, speak, build, and when they ask what your legacy will be, tell them you're living it.